At this point of time, for Iran, they have signaled an intention to continue. They probably feel that this is a war that should not be left unfinished for it to return to them a year later.
I think the challenge is the president did not make a sustained case for war prior to the onset of hostilities on February 28th. The American people were not prepared that they might need to shoulder a burden.
Premise, the foundation of Gulf prosperity was that it was a safe, secure, stable place where you could come, invest, and profit.
The percentage of people that support the war is very close to the percentage of people that approve of the US president.
Hello and welcome. You're watching India and the World on DeKoder. I'm Nidhi Razdan. It's been 12 days since Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu decided to launch strikes against Iran, and this is a war that appears to be going absolutely nowhere. Perhaps miscalculating Iran's response, Trump now seems to be in a position where he doesn't quite know how to end this war and how to exit it in a way that appears that he has won. That's why perhaps we're also seeing contradictory statements from the US president over the last few days about whether this war is close to ending or whether it's just beginning. And as if that wasn't bad enough, the stress that this conflict is putting on the world economy, particularly on global oil prices, is now really beginning to show. India imports about 60% of its LNG supplies, and about 90% of those imports pass through that waterway known as the Strait of Hormuz, which is effectively closed at the moment because Iran is bombing ships and tankers that are transporting oil passing through it. And so that is hitting oil supplies around the world and even in India. And we've heard today the International Energy Agency saying that this could create or is already in the process of creating one of the world's worst energy oil supply crises that we've ever seen. So, where is all of this headed? What happens next? What could be an off ramp that would be respectable to both the Iranians and the Americans? Joining us now, first on the program, is Ambassador Javed Ashraf. He's been India's ambassador to France. He has worked closely with Prime Minister Modi in the Prime Minister's office and is currently heading the Indian Trade Promotion Organization. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ashraf, for joining us. I just wanted to first get your overall take 12 days into this conflict, into this war. Uh, do you see any signs at all that this could end soon, or are you worried that this may just stretch out a lot longer than we thought?
Well, Nidhi, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. As you rightly said, I'm currently chairing Indian Trade Promotion Organization, but I'm speaking here in my personal capacity and as a former diplomat. Um, I think that you've laid it out extremely well. As of today, there is no signs of either of the contestants actually trying to seek a genuine off ramp, publicly speaking. There may be, as it always happens in these situations, that there would be back channels working. But at this point of time, for Iran, they have signaled an intention to continue. They probably feel that this is a war that should not be left unfinished for it to return to them a year later when the United States and Israel have regrouped. Second, for the Gulf states here, they have been the collateral damage, or they have suffered a great collateral damage, not just simply in terms of assets or in terms of infrastructure that has been hit, but their premise, the foundation of Gulf prosperity, was that it was a safe, secure, stable place where you could come, invest, and profit. And that it enjoyed some sort of a security guarantees by the United States and some sort of an unwritten norms of the region. That has come crashing. It remains to be seen whether that can come back. So, for Gulf states, while they must be very angry about this, but I think at the street level, there would still be a fair amount of support for Iran, because there is something about resonates about an underdog fighting against a major power. There's something about a global South country fighting against a major Western country, and about the religious dimension of it as well. So I think the Gulf states are also under pressure, and that brings me to Israel and the United States. In the case of Israel, I mean, they have probably, and the people have not experienced something like this. Again, there was a sense of absolute safety for the Jewish community in Israel, a place they could go and believe that they can live safely. That has also been shattered quite a lot. But there will still be support for the Prime Minister Netanyahu's war because of the way Iran is seen there. And finally, for the United States, I mean, this is something which was clearly not thought through because it is very evident that the premise on which this war was fought was that the regime will collapse in 48 hours, there will be an uprising, and that there will be other ethnic groups that will come in, and some sort of chaotic period will be followed by
So a
a
total
new regime.
miscalculation by Trump, a total
Yes.
miscalculation by Trump and his administration.
So I think this at this point of time, it is very difficult for him to simply say, as he has done on many occasions, "Oh, the war is over. I've accomplished my goals," because it will also require Iran to back off, and it would require some credible. Some credible signs of actually achieved some objective. As you rightly said, he's been constantly changing his objectives. So one is that you redefine your goals and lower what your expectations are, and then say you achieved it. But then that would also require Iran to comply or accept that. And you've seen that Iran has probably laid terms for negotiations which
Yeah.
are designed to be rejected by the United States and Israel.
But let
And
me ask
so,
you, does it appear to you that Iran was definitely better prepared for this round, given the 12-day war that happened last year when it was bombarded with American and Israeli strikes in the summer of last year? The sense one gets is that this time Iran was prepared for this escalation. And the fact that, as you said, it is really hurting Gulf countries and this aura of prosperity and safe haven that they drew. Could that be something that would put pressure on Washington to back off? Like, do you see a point where perhaps already Qatar and the UAE and other countries in the region are saying we are really suffering? You need to find a way out.
so you've raised, two fundamental questions. One, was Iran ready? I think Iran has been preparing for this since the Islamic Revolution, and particularly, I would say, after the Iraq War in 2003. Remember, Iran and Israel actually cooperated with each other uh, during Shah's regime till 1979, but strangely also continued to cooperate with each other after the Iranian Revolution because of the Iraq War. And at that point of time, it was very interesting that in United States was supporting uh, Iraq, but was also routing weapons through Israel into Iran, which led to that Contra scandal, Iran Contra scandal, where the money was used to finance the insurgency against the Sandinista in Nicaragua in the 80s. So until 1990s, because Iraq was seen as a common threat, that Israel and Iran had some sort of a cooperation. So it's, Iran, after 2000, their missile program, their capacities have been increasing. And I would say that 2003 Iraq war was a wake up call for them. So this is something that is a given. I think Iran has also recognized and realized perhaps that as it happened last year, there is no good faith negotiations, and that it is only used as a means to prepare the ground for war by rejecting any offer, and that this is going to be a continuous cycle. And remember, at this point of time, they've had the loss of their supreme leader. And if you look at the Shiite tradition, and everyone is talking about it now, is that they probably see this as an event happening after 1600 years, literally, or 1500 years, when you've seen the martyrdom in their view of supreme leader. So it has a extremely strong sense of inspiration for them. So, war is not just about military power, it is about mental will also, and the sort of a
Yeah.
national resolve. And this is where you see for Arab countries, for Sunni Gulf countries, they've bought the best equipment in the world from the United States. They can pay for it. For all that equipment, but are they capable of fighting? That is something which, to my mind,
Long term.
long term, that's not there. So, what could happen? One, that they may realize that it may be, while they always see the current Iranian regime, and I just don't mean the supreme leader, but the revolutionary,
Guard.
post-revolutionary Iran, as a non-status quoist revolutionary force which is out to upset the regional balance, particularly in the Gulf states. Now, they may also realize that, and Iran may realize, a post-war Iran, that they need a modus vivendi to coexist. And that can, this region has always had, has had different kinds of permutations and combinations. There's nothing that has been static. Once Israel saw Iran as a counterweight against the Arab, today the Arabs see Israel as the counterweight. And in each case, they've had the United States at the back. So today we are looking at a situation where they might actually, at the end of it, say that, look, it's best, we are better off if we don't have these bases here, or let's find a modus vivendi to work with
Yeah,
Iran. But
because those bases have made them sitting ducks
yes,
and targets. I mean,
yes,
even today, there have been reports of. I mean,
yes,
I think a lot of things are not being perhaps honestly reported out of the UAE, but it's coming out in this age of social media. There's only so much you can censor about the damage it's doing
yeah.
as you said, to the reputation and
Mm,
to these countries. But Javed Ashraf, let me also ask you about the Indian position on all of this. Now, as you know, a lot of your former colleagues in the foreign service, some of them have been very critical of the position that India took initially,
mm.
not condemning the assassination of the supreme leader of Iran, or saying a critical word on the strikes themselves, which India still hasn't done. Clearly, India has now spelt out its position in terms of how it's prioritizing Indian people living in the region, energy security, and so on. But in your view, um, is it a mistake to not take a position on a unilateral attack on a sovereign nation? You may not like their leadership; they may be terrible people, but the precedent that it sets. Should India, as the world's largest democracy, have taken a position on this?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, there are two separate layers at which you need to look at. One is, of course, the universally accepted principles and of the Charter of the United Nations, sovereignty and territorial integrity. That's one part of it, uh, and the- and and the second part of it is that a country looks at its balance of interests at a particular point of time. Now, in a situation like this, you look at not just the long term, but you would immediately start looking at what are my immediate, um, stakes in this conflict. And I think the feeling may have been, and I'm not privy to the discussions in the government. And while I think a lot of people have criticized or expressed concern about the fact that we were silent on that issue of the unilateral violation, the killing of the supreme leader, etc. There would have been a calculation that the sentiments in the Gulf countries, in Israel, would be so strong and so sharp against Iran that we have too much at stake in terms of our people, our markets, our sources of supply, our strategic partnership, our technological collaboration, and access for our own security. And that this may also have been a view that in the short run or in the long run, there would be some kind of rationalization. I'm not saying it will happen or not happen. I'm not also saying that they may have thought, government would have thought that the regime is going to collapse, but they might have assumed that this is going to be not a similar kind of a war that we've seen in the past, that down the line there would be some kind of a change, if not in the regime, but in the approach of the regime, and that India can then start rebuilding its relationship
So I
with
I, I
Iran as well.
understand.
But I want to
Okay,
stop you for. I just don't. I wanted to say
yeah.
something that this is not the first
Hmm.
time that sometimes where our position has created. Sort of, people have been nonplussed by the position. We've had these situations in the past also, and including, if you recall, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1980, when we had very close ties with Soviet Union, We had very good ties with Afghanistan before that. We were the largest aid provider or development partner for Afghanistan. But the position we took at that time was took into account, or whether it was in Vietnam. So I would say that sometimes, I'm not saying it. I agree or disagree with this decision, but I would say that I think sometimes the complexity of the situation, and the immediate calculations, assumptions about how it will unfold, what impact it will have on our immediate interests, do sway
I
government's
I
decisions.
I understand. I understand that because you kind of spelt out perhaps what the thinking in the government of India could be, because we are not really privy to that apart from short statements from the government of India. But having said that, when you look at the White House and you look at statements coming out of the US, in which frankly, as I put on social media just yesterday, are so patronizing, in that the White House press secretary is kind of saying that, well, we allowed India, we have permitted India to purchase Russian oil for a short period of time because they have been good actors in all of this. And there is complete silence from the government of India on the tone and the tenor of the American position. um, the fact that it appears that we are almost subservient to American interests at this point. Now, that may not be the case, you're right, but perception does matter in politics and in diplomacy. So do you think it's wise to stay silent, as the Americans make it look like you're doing everything as per their wishes?
I think, finally, let the actions speak for themselves. First of all, I'd say that this has been going on since January of 2025, and some of those kinds of wild statements, and provocative statements we've seen even during the first term of President Trump. Now, since January of last year, the government's strategy has been not to get engaged in a war of words, react to everything he says, President Trump or the administration says. And in a way, sometimes it does convey an impression that you are referring to. But it was also based on the calculations that if we get into a slanging match with someone who has who's really unprecedented in international relations as far as use of social media platform is concerned, to say things that go well beyond any kind of civilized norm sometimes. And if you are saying that, should we react to it? Uh, if that reaction is going to help manage our diplomacy or manage our interests, then it may be worth it. But if the calculation is that let him say what he wants, let the administration say what it wants, but we will try to pursue what our best interests are. So I would say this, that let's talk about oil. We have had a lot of speculation on this issue, that we had agreed to cut down and taper off oil purchases from Russia. We may or may not have, but I was going to wait till to see whether we actually finally do it on the ground, and whether we are in a position to negotiate that later. Now, sometimes when you are negotiating in situations like this, you also have to take a call. At what point do you say this is enough? Could we have waited for the Supreme Court judgment? Could we have
On
waited
tariffs,
uh,
yeah.
or could we have prolonged this till the next congressional election? But then remember, there is the counter argument about the damage it does to your economic interests. Now, the war here is an example of an unanticipated development, or which probably through all the calculations that we had made in just a few
Sure,
weeks
but
ago. Yeah.
it just comes back to the point that you know how it is, right? When I don't know if you were bullied in school, and I've seen people who were bullied in school. Fortunately, I wasn't. But if they didn't stand up to the bully, he would or she would come back to keep beating them. So at some point, it's about dignity and
Yeah.
self respect, and I think I think that was just the limited point there. Ambassador
Yeah,
Javed Ashraf, we're out of time, but thank you so much for giving us some perspective on what could be going on in the
yeah.
minds of the leadership here in India as we wade through this crisis. Thank you for your perspective on this story.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. Right, thanks.
Well, as we enter the nearly 2 week mark of this war, joining us on Decoder now is Professor Christopher Clary. He's a non resident fellow at the Stimson Center and also teaches political science at the University of Albany in New York, in the United States. Thank you very much, Professor Clary, for being with us. Uh, we began this show really by talking about whether Donald Trump had miscalculated Iran's response to the American and Israeli strikes. What is your view? Did they underestimate Iran's response? And do you think they're kind of struggling to find a respectable way out of this?
I think that's a fair characterization of the circumstances facing the US and the world today. They kind of caused themselves to believe that a successful first strike that killed the senior-most leaders of Iran would cause the regime in Tehran to be so lost that they might quickly capitulate. And now we're in a slugfest. It's my assessment that the US is winning that slugfest, but it's not at all clear to me that the US is degrading Iran's military capabilities at a rate that is fast enough to deal with the economic and political repercussions of the war. And it is my assessment that the president could find a face-saving way out, that he would probably take it.
What do you think that face saver could possibly be? And I'm asking this question at a time when oil prices have crossed that today they crossed that $100 a barrel, the Brent crude up about $30 from the end of February, and there are now major concerns being flagged that this could be the worst crisis that we see with international oil prices in decades. So, is that something that could force his hand? Could it be the Gulf countries who've become collateral damage in all of this? What could that be, and what could that face saver be?
Well, the administration has shifted somewhat over time what its goals are for this endeavor. Initially, in the immediate hours after the strike on February 28th, the president indicated the goals included regime change, and he has dabbled in that as being a war aim ever since, including saying that he needed to have a say on the next supreme leader of Iran. He was obviously hoping he could wind up with a Delcy Rodriguez situation, which worked out fairly favorably for the US so far in Venezuela. But that situation has not been apparent. So now we're left with the other war aims. I think the US and Israel are making meaningful progress at destroying Iranian missiles every day, at destroying Iran's military. As it was not the most impressive conventional military force in the world, but it is much weaker today than it was in February. And we are making some progress, the US and Israel, in destroying the nuclear capabilities of Iran, though those are in hardened facilities. And it is not clear that we've made enough progress there. So I think if the US and Israel, with airstrikes, or even more ambitiously, if it were to require special forces, which I think is probably not going to happen because of the dangers associated with it. But if the US could meaningfully say to itself that Iran's nuclear capabilities were set back even beyond what they had been set back by the 2025 strikes, that might allow the administration to declare victory here. Because I think we still have many days before the Strait of Hormuz is sufficiently safe to calm global markets.
Uh, I just wanted to get a sense from you also about how this is impacting ordinary Americans in terms of the impact on gas prices. For instance, I was reading that is already beginning to take effect in higher gas prices, and we're saying here in India, for example, an Essential Services Act has been invoked. Gas allocation has been prioritized. Restaurants in some big cities have had to shut down because they're running low on cooking gas supply. So obviously now this is beginning to hurt people in ways that they probably didn't expect at the beginning of this war. So how is that playing out in the US?
I think the challenge is the president did not make a sustained case for war prior to the onset of hostilities on February 28th. The American people were not prepared that they might need to shoulder a burden. They were not even prepared to understand why the president thought Iran was a special threat. As someone that lived through the run up to the Iraq War in 2003, even though I might be critical of the administration's case for war against Iraq, the Bush administration made a sustained multi month case of the necessity for war. So people were not surprised when it occurred. But many normal Americans were surprised. And as a consequence, they are not prepared to accept even relatively modest changes to their livelihoods or to their lives. I do think those changes have been very modest in the U.S. case. The U.S. is an energy exporter. We have kind of more natural gas than we wouldn't know what to do with, and then we also have plenty of oil as well. There have been increases in gas prices. Those are irritating to Americans, but that has not yet caused a political crisis. And Bismarck, the famous Prussian statesman, said that God has a special affection for fools, drunkards in the United States of America, and that may be the case here. The people that may suffer the most are economies and societies that have nothing to do with the conflict. Poor economies in Asia, they are now bidding against European, Japanese, other wealthy economies for these natural gas shipments, for these tanker shipments, and I think that's really where the danger is. The U.S., the economic danger will be irritating, and it will continue for a while because we've also seen this global disruption in fertilizer. We've got an ongoing global disruption in lots of other small things. Helium, there's a lot of helium that's produced by Qatar during normal days. So we have ripples through the supply chain for a while, and I think it will probably degrade the president's approval rating, is my assessment, but I think it will not
which is
become
already
a normal
down.
situation.
Yeah, and his approval ratings are already down, which actually leads well into my next question, which is that we've actually seen a lot of disquiet in the sort of MAGA camp about this war. A lot of MAGA influencers and bloggers who've been strong supporters of President Trump have been openly putting their thoughts on social media platforms about why they don't support this war. The vice president has also kind of disappeared and has hardly said anything in the last couple of weeks, hasn't he? So with the midterms also coming up in a few months, do you sense that the political blowback to this, especially if it drags on, would cause the Republicans to pay a big price?
Well, I think the polling, the prediction markets already suggest the Republicans are in a difficult position going into the elections later this year. So much so that they're in some danger of losing the upper house, the U.S. Senate, which people did not think was even a reach goal for the Democrats last year. So there are some real political repercussions. It does seem like he's managed to hold the members of Congress together thus far, and the polling suggests a little fracturing within the Republican Party, but largely the percentage of people that support the war is very close to the percentage of people that approve of the U.S. president, and he's holding his core base. The problem is he's not persuading independent voters, and he's persuading almost no Democratic voters to support the war, and that has meant that he's not gotten a rally around the flag, which other U.S. presidents have gotten when they've engaged in similar hostilities.
Professor Clary, thank you very much for joining us today to give us a perspective from the US on how this war is playing out, especially for domestic audiences back home. We really don't know at this point whether this will be over in a day or in a month or even longer. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And that's it on India and the World this week. We'll be back with much more in a few days as we track this war and its impact on India in particular closely. Goodbye.